So this panel is going to begin with each of us introducing ourselves and then telling a short story of an experience of the impossible. So my name is Annalisa Ventola. I am the executive director of the Parapsychological Association. I'm a consultant to the Society for Scientific Exploration. And I'm also the founder of a community website called Public Parapsychology. And the purpose of that site is to advance parapsychological research and efforts that inform and are informed by the public good. Now, for my story, I'm going to tell the story of the very first impossible experience I remember, which surprisingly I was in my 20s when it happened, and I had just dropped out of school for a brief bit, and I was working a dead-end job in Columbus, Ohio, and the workday was over, and I'm standing at the corner of Broad and High, which is the center of Columbus, Ohio. And at that point, it was a place that all of the buses, all the bus routes would converge. And so I'm standing on the corner, and it's very busy. Everybody's coming and going. And, knowing me, I'm daydreaming. I'm probably thinking about what I'm having for dinner that night. And then suddenly I think to myself, shame on me for standing between friends. And then I'm like, wait, what was that? So I take a look around, and I notice that I'm almost 6 feet tall. And in front of me, there is this very, very tiny elderly woman. And then I look around behind me, and I see that there's also another tiny elderly woman. And I was like, okay, I'm standing between friends. So I do one action. I take a step to the left. And that's it. A moment or two goes by, and the woman who was in front of me turns around, and she says, "Oh, Fran! Wow, what are you, oh my gosh, it's been years, what are you doing?" And Fran's like, "Oh, Beatrice, oh my gosh, it must have been Frank's wedding. And how are Bill and the kids?" And they have this conversation like they are friends, and they are friends who have not seen each other in a very long time. Anyhow, I just stood there and watched the conversation. At one point, the woman who was in front of me, her bus came. She's like, "Well, that's my bus. It was so great catching up with you." She took off. Then my bus came, and I picked my jaw up off the floor, and I got on my bus, and that was that. So I'm gonna hop down to Gail, and then we'll make our way back to me.
I'm Gail Husick, and this is a homecoming of sorts for me. I graduated from Rice in 1986 with a degree in economics, and then went on to Harvard Law School and spent a decade practicing securities law in Silicon Valley, working mostly with technology companies. And ordinary reality was working pretty well for me, and I really didn't have much use for most of the things we're talking about at this conference. And then I had some life-changing experiences where I realized that there was a whole field, a whole reality that I knew nothing about, and I needed to go explore that. And it took a while to get plugged in and really kind of find my bearings. One of the first things that I found that was helpful was Stanley Krippner's work on dream telepathy. And that's where I realized that these things are real, and we can acknowledge them, and we can also study them scientifically. And that got me a little bit back in my comfort zone so I could start exploring this. And that led me to remote viewing, and I studied and trained in remote viewing. And now I run a group of professional remote viewers at the Husick Group, and we provide remote viewing services to clients like law enforcement, private individuals, journalists, really anyone who needs information that they can't get in ordinary ways. And the story I want to tell you is one of the projects from our team. We had been asked to use our remote viewing skills to assist law enforcement on a case involving a missing hiker. And one of the viewers submitted a remote viewing session indicating that the hiker was at a one-story blue wooden building, and that the owner of this building had a bottle collection that he was very proud of and displayed on shelves. And across the street from this one-story blue wooden building was something like a coffee shop or a cafe, and it had out front a sign or a statue with a representation of a large animal like a moose. So this was very specific. And I had some information about the hiker's last known position on the trail where he had last been seen. And so I went into Google Maps and started looking at inhabited areas near that spot to see if I could find a match for what our remote viewer had described. And it didn't take long before I was down in Street View in Google Maps. I found in a small town near that spot on the trail a one-story blue wooden building, and it was a tavern, which of course had bottles displayed on shelves. And across the street from the tavern was a coffee shop. And in front of the coffee shop was a huge statue of an elk. Not a moose, but an elk. Close enough. So this was really promising, and I reported this to our law enforcement contact so that they could use this in their investigation. And it didn't take long before he got back to me to let me know that they had confirmed that the hiker had been at that tavern, and they had found an eyewitness who had shared a meal with the hiker there. So we were hot on the trail, so to speak. The story that I just told you should have been impossible, because the viewer who was working on that was working completely blind, per our normal protocols. And what I mean by that is that viewer had been given no information about who we were looking for, the circumstances of their disappearance, what part of the planet they had gone missing in. He knew nothing about the case, and yet was able to provide this level of detail. All of the information that that viewer provided was acquired by purely mental or psychic means. So conventional wisdom would tell you this story just can't be true, but it is, and if I had more time, I could tell you dozens more very much like this one.
Okay. Kind of hard to follow that, but I'll try. My name's Elizabeth Krohn, and I guess as a little background, my education, I went to the University of Texas at Austin, and and then I finished at the University of Houston. I got married very young, and we moved back to Houston. I was 19, and I finished at the University of Houston. My undergrad degree is in business, and then I went to law school there. And that gave me no basis for what was about to happen to me. I'm sorry if I'm reading this, but I didn't want to run over. And when I start talking about what happened to me, I tend to talk a long time. So in 1988, I was 28 years old, and I was struck by lightning in the parking lot of my synagogue, which is actually right across the street over there. What followed was a very intense near-death experience in which I traveled to a beautiful garden, found myself steeped in and surrounded by and infused with this unconditional love, unlike any love that exists here. And I had the most informative conversation I've ever had. I was given a choice, and I chose to come back to this life. However, when I returned, I was not the same person I had been when I left. I found that I had been either gifted or cursed with precognitive abilities that I did not want. Physically, there were also changes, in addition to the burns that were on my body from the lightning. I now see auras around all living beings, including plants, animals, and of course humans. I have something called synesthesia, which is very hard to live with sometimes. And I have a very dysfunctional relationship with electricity. I can't wear watches or Fitbits or anything like that. And sometimes when I'm walking, like I was at my daughter's house a couple of years ago and I was walking downstairs, and as I walked down, the light bulbs blew out in the stairwell above me as I went down. Other than telling my husband and my mother, and fortunately a therapist that understood what had happened, I didn't talk about my NDE publicly until 2015. That was 27 years after it had happened. It's now been 33 years, and I still recall every detail of it as if it happened an hour ago. And there's a lot more detail, but I will stop there.
So I'm sitting here wondering if I should keep my arm with my Fitbit on it away from Elizabeth here.
Not a bad
At
idea.
the same thought.
And the fact that I lost my cell phone today is probably very good for my cell phone.
So I'm Paul H. Smith. I put the H in there because there are a lot of Paul Smiths out there. Paul H. Smith. I'm a retired major in Army intelligence, Desert Storm veteran from southern Utah now. That I did spend 17 years up in Austin getting my PhD in unemployment, as my wife says. I have a PhD, that's a doctorate in philosophy, and I focused on philosophy of mind, consciousness, philosophy of science, and philosophy of parapsychology. But that's not why I'm here. As a captain in the Army for 7 years, I was a psychic spy for the military, literally. I was taught how to be a remote viewer, which is a form of disciplined clairvoyance, to oversimplistically describe it. And for 7 years, spied on the Soviets or the Hezbollah or narco-traffickers or tried to find hostages in the Middle East, all that kind of thing. And there's a lot more I could say about that, but that's probably enough to introduce me for these purposes. So on May 15th, 1987, I was invited over to our operations building to do a remote viewing session. I use the word invited to kind of dress up what the Army does do with you, right? I was asked to go over there to do an operational remote viewing session. Now, as a remote viewer, you can't know what the target is, what it is they want you to remote view. There's a number of reasons for that, maybe we'll talk about later. But so I go over and sit down, and I'm given this series of numbers, 369-147, 312-200. Now, I didn't know what that was for, what that it was hooked up to, but my subconscious found out, and it turned out later that what I was being asked to do was remote view whatever event in the near future was most important for the Department of Defense to know about. This is what I like to call a psychic or remote viewing fishing expedition, just to see if there's something out there that we need to have early warning on, right? And so then I proceeded to go through this process that I've been taught, and I described a large metallic structure moving through water in the dark of night. And that sort of resolved itself into the water being kind of a body of seawater surrounded by flat, sandy land, much in the distance, but still surrounded. The vessel gave me strong impressions of being a U.S. destroyer, of a warship of some kind. I got the impression of a flight deck, of radars, of all that kind of stuff, and I'm going along. And in the process, I got the impression of way off in the distance, an aircraft kind of orbiting. And then the aircraft dropped one or two of these little cylindrical objects with short, stubby wings that made a guttural roaring sound that kind of flew around kind of aimlessly. And until at some point, those objects and this vessel came together, and there was smoke and flame and loud noises, and the vessel canted to one side, and the people on the vessel were really, they were screaming and running around and milling around and shouting and all kinds of things. I got the impression of fire hoses on the deck and flame and smoke and all of that kind of thing. And I got a bunch more of information as well. I won't get into that right now. And after about, I don't know, I could tell you how long exactly, but about half an hour, 45 minutes, my monitor, the guy who was supposed to help me with the session, said, okay, well, I guess we're done. I guess you're off, but that's okay. Nobody's on all the time. He didn't know what to expect either, but he had some kind of pre-biases as to what he thought I was going to report on. Okay, I get up, go over the operations building, put my session in the file drawer, transcript. We write everything down that we verbalized, put it in my safe drawer, went home for the weekend. Monday morning, I get a phone call from our operations officer, a guy named Skip Atwater. Some of you may know him because he was a very important guy at the Monroe Institute for a long time after his military service. Skip calls me up and says, hey, Paul, where's that session you did on Friday? And I said, well, it's in my safe drawer. Why do you care? He said, you haven't seen the papers this morning, have you? And no, I've been getting my kids off school, all that kind of stuff. I didn't have time to mess with it. So I opened up my copy of the Washington Post. U.S. frigate attacked by Iraqi jet with Exocet missiles. It's on fire. 37 Americans died. Pictures of the ship showed it leaning like this, with smoke and flames coming off of it. And I read that newspaper story, and I see my session unfold, what I described, 50 hours before it happened. So I've done a lot of remote viewing sessions. I've done some pretty remarkable ones. I've also messed up a bunch. You never are 100% with this, right? But that was by far the best session I ever did and the most accurate. Because several years later, I was taking an indications warning class at the Defense Intelligence College, and that Stark, the name of the ship was the USS Stark. That incident was one of their learning things, and I was able to read the after-action report, and it matched my session in every detail. I didn't leave anything out. Of course, my detail wasn't quite as rich as what the newspapers and the after-action report reported, but I also didn't include anything. Normally you get some noise in a remote viewing session. It was very remarkable. Okay, so just to finish up, you hear a lot of stories out there about remote viewing, about being psychic, and usually it's anecdotal. You sort of have to believe what the teller is telling you, right? I have evidence. In the CIA archives that were released starting in about 2004 are the original session transcript. This is a photocopy of it, but the whole thing is right here, the way I recounted it. And I also have a printout of the after-action report. And if you were to compare the two, we're not going to do it because that would take a long time, but if you compare the two, you'd see a remarkable resemblance. And skeptics have tried to deny that this was successful. They tried to figure out how to fit it into their various explanations of how people think they're being psychic and they're not. It doesn't work because this is fully attested and the detail is so rich, there's no way you can argue against it. So I will leave it at that, and I'm sure we'll come back to more of this experiential stuff in a minute.
All right. Wow. The pleasures of going last.
You'll do fine.
Right? I'll try. My name is Sravana Borkataky-Varma. I am a scholar practitioner of Shakta Tantra, which is goddess Tantra, and I, kind of come from the Hindu tradition. But I'm not going to share a story on or an experience from Tantra, but an experience that I haven't quite still figured out what to do with it. So just a little backstory. When I said I'm a scholar practitioner, I was initiated at a very young age. My first initiation into the goddess practice in the temple called Kamakhya was at the age of 8. And then I went through my final initiation, which is called as Abhishekam in Sanskrit, was at 15. And this was 1980, I did the math, but I forgot, but 1989. And so at that time, when the final initiation happened, they gave me a piece of metal. The guru who initiated me gave me a very small piece of metal and said, always have it with you. 27 years, I've never lived without it. Not a single moment. I used to wear it for the longest period of time. And then too many people would ask, so, but long story cut short, I never lived without it. 2016, I'm in Auschwitz, the Auschwitz in Poland. I'd gone for a conference, so I decided to visit the museum. And when we walk in, there is a hallway. At the end of the hallway, there is a glass urn. I'm not sure if any one of you have been there. And it's a big glass urn which has the ashes. They kind of kept a little bit of the ashes from the crematorium. And so I walk in, I have this very strange bodily reaction. And the next thing I know, this piece of metal is in the glass urn inside, staring at me. And remember, this is a piece of metal I've had a relationship with for 27 years. So I panic. I mean, even now I feel very, 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 sensorially activated. So I panic, and I know where it always is. So I look, it's not there. And the moments from there are like so fast. I've tried to figure it out, but from extreme panic, like confusion, extreme panic, confusion, I'm looking at this piece of metal, it's mine, but how did it get inside the urn? And, what is happening? To this moment of intense clarity where something like I don't want to say it's a voice. At the same time, I don't know what to say, so I'll say it's a voice, which tells me, you were the custodian. You were supposed to bring it. It is meant for someone here who needs it, and that's why you've left it behind. And while I had this huge confusion, and I still sometimes miss it, but at the same time, I felt intensely, grateful that I was the custodian and I kept it safe and I left it where it was meant. So that's my experience. And as I said, like many of us, we're still figuring it out. So yeah, I'm going to stop there.
You did top mine.
So it was a couple months ago that Jeff asked me to speak here for about 10 or 15 minutes, and on anything relating to experiencing the impossible, and I still plan to make the best use of that time. So as I mentioned before, I am the executive director of the Parapsychological Association, and I get the great privilege to work with these authors of the impossible on a daily basis. I work with people whose research is either, sometimes it's celebrated, but often it's ignored, or even worse, shunned. So I'm going to take my 10 minutes to amplify their voices for a moment on a paper that came out very recently. And the paper was published in January of 2022. It was published in Frontiers in Psychology, which is a high-impact mainstream psychology journal. And the title is When the Truth is Out There, Counseling People Who Report Anomalous Experiences. Now, I'm not a clinician. I don't want to get too deep into clinical discussion because I won't be able to handle the Q&A. But this paper is rich with some background on what this burgeoning field of clinical parapsychology knows about these experiences, how often we see them in the population, and has also some suggestions on how to make the most of them. And so I just want to briefly summarize some of the main points. So it was written by Dr. Thomas Rabiron, who, in addition to many university appointments, he is a co-founder of the Center for Information Research and Counseling about Exceptional Experiences in France. They call it CIRCE for short. And in the beginning of the article, he talks about the types of experiences that we're talking about. And so he lists things like psychic impressions, visions and apparitions, OBEs, psychokinesis and poltergeists, magnetism or healing experiences, encounter experiences, NDEs, mediumistic communications, recollection of a past life, like such as reincarnation, mystical experiences, and abductions. And in his literature review, he shows that a lot of the surveys of the population shows that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population reports having at least one such experience during their lifetime, which suggests that these experiences are pretty normal. Now, out of those 1/3 to 1/2 of people who report these experiences, nearly half of them are untroubled by them or consider them pleasant, but the other half may find them distressing. Previous research in this area has shown that the relationship between anomalous or extraordinary experiences the relationship between those experiences and mental disorders is complex, but it cannot be reduced to psychopathology, even if they are frequently associated with trauma. I've done my own research in haunting experiences. I've also found that I have failed to find a correlation between haunting experiences and any kind of cognitive deficiencies in the percipient. Our journals are filled with these kinds of studies. We cannot tie it to psychopathology or to cognitive deficiency. Unfortunately, there is the suffering of people who have distressing experiences is increased because of the difficulty about talking about them. And this is due to the fear of being considered weird or crazy, or they may prefer not to speak about them because they feel shame and fear about being misunderstood. And this fear is relevant given that most clinicians have not received any specific training in this domain. For example, in this paper, they studied a 2004 study in the Netherlands where they questioned 640 mental health practitioners. Half of those practitioners reported patient experiences, anomalous or extraordinary experiences. However, only 4 out of 5 of these clinicians had any kind of experience or information about how to counsel extraordinary experiences. Now, there have been a variety of psychotherapeutic approaches that have been developing in clinical parapsychology since the 1960s. One landmark is the publication of the varieties of anomalous experience, which was published by the American Psychological Association in 2000. It had 3 authors. One of them is with us, Dr. Stanley Krippner. It was published in 2000. It was reprinted again in 2014. It is an excellent synthesis of knowledge on these topics. And since the publication of that book, the community of clinicians has grown. The first meeting of international experts took place in 2007. It was followed by another meeting in 2009, another one in 2012, and accepting the pandemic situation, those meetings have taken place roughly every 2 years since then. Currently, there are 2 centers in Germany that is devoted to counseling extraordinary experiences, one in France, one in Scotland, one that is currently in development in the UK, and that's it. So in this article, Dr. Rabion highlighted what he calls a psychodynamic psychotherapy model, and it is extraordinarily simple. And so I want to share that model with you because, as he says in the paper, that this model can be useful for even clinicians who don't have background at all. It can also be useful if you're talking to your friends. So it begins, again, we're going to go back to clinical setting for a moment. It begins with a phenomenological exploration. So first, what happened? Just, what were the events? And then following that is a subjective integration of the experience. And that is, what are your feelings about what happened? At this point, it might become useful to attempt to depathologize the phenomena. And it's really as simple as saying that having an experience does not make you crazy, and many people have experienced similar things. At this time, you can also encourage a sense of detachment. I have encountered people who've had experiences and think maybe now they're called to, there might be a calling, but it's like, I'm a god because I had this experience. But we would find that being able to have a certain amount of detachment is probably healthy. And then finally, after that, we try to get at the meaning of the experience. And something that the field of clinical parapsychology has found, that these experiences do often happen, not always, but often happen during or after a strong emotional event. And so sharing the experience, sharing the event that might connect it, helps us to metabolize what has happened. So sadly, most clinicians are still not trained on how to deal with these experiences. And patients, experiencers can still expect an attitude of rejection, a reduction to mental disorders. And sadly enough, that creates what we call a secondary trauma of having been judged. So the advice at the end of the article is that it's important to welcome unusual experiences in a way that helps the person sharing with you to know that they are understood, even if it challenges your own worldview. So I do have some questions and to stimulate a discussion. But first I want to invite anybody on the panel who might want to comment.
About what you just said?
Yeah.
Okay. So Annalisa graciously shared this paper with me, and I found it really quite interesting. Just to kind of drill down to one point, though. So if 50% roughly of people have negative experiences with this, that's an interesting figure, and I think that there are some social causes of it, not necessarily phenomenal causes of it. So, for example, I've done now thousands of remote viewing sessions, and some of them were against pretty negative targets. Two that immediately come to mind is I was targeted on a Soviet accident in a Soviet bio-warfare lab, and I came across in this process one of the folks there who was in the process of choking to death from whatever was in the air. And that was somewhat disturbing to me, but we were taught modalities to how to deal with that, and so I did. And okay, so it was a negative target. I wouldn't say I had a negative experience with it. I was able to integrate it, and I love this phrase, metabolize what happened, right? Another one was we're supposed to remote view the current condition and state of Lieutenant Colonel Bill Higgins, who had been kidnapped by Hezbollah in Lebanon, and at the time, I determined that he was dead. And I mean, that was unsettling, but again, I knew how to deal with that. I think oftentimes what happens, and this is acknowledged somewhat in this paper, is when people have an anomalous experience, the content of the experience really isn't necessarily negative. In fact, in probably most cases, it's not. It may be somewhat neutral and depend on the person's individual interpretation of what it was they experienced. But even more often, they count it as negative because they are afraid of what will happen if they tell others about it. I get lots of emails and phone calls and such from people who have had this happen. They've had these experiences, and there's no one they feel safe in explaining it to. So they'll call me up because they think I will at least understand, which is true, right? And that has to do with the social context. So our society, Western society in particular, has tended to, what's the word we like to use, marginalize these kind of people who have these kind of experiences. We think they're, because we don't have an explanation for it, we think it's a subjective experience, they're making it up, they must be a little bit on the edge mentally or whatever. And so there's a kind of a stigma that's associated with this. And people who have these spontaneous kind of ESP experiences, for example, and I'll talk in those terms because those are the most, in a way, innocent of the bunch. You know, they spontaneously have an ESP experience, never had it before. It's a little disturbing because they're a little bit worried what will happen socially to them if they're reported. And so they experience it as a negative, they interpret it negatively. There's this phenomenon in our modern culture that I call media, and let's see, how do I say it? Media-generated fear. We see this all the time, right? If there's a mass shooting, a terrorist event, a war going on, the media constantly reports this over and over and over again. 724. Favorite story of mine is during the Gulf War. I was there, but we did get a CNN feed for a while. There was one infantry company that got trapped under a freeway bridge in the middle of an Iraqi mortar attack. And they were only there for a little while, nobody got hurt. But CNN kept showing that same event over and over and over again. And I was getting mail from people at home saying, wow, we're really getting killed over there, you know. And no, we weren't. Okay? The media had generated that feeling of fear amongst the American populace. And we get that all the time. Even now you notice during the Ukrainian thing. That's a bad situation. But the media is giving that perception to us even worse. We get anxious about that because we have this media-generated fear. Well, analogically, that's what's happening when people have these exceptional experiences. And they have an anomalous experience, if you will, and they're worried because the social context makes those seem like a bad thing. Okay. There's one other factor here, though, and that's, I had a term for it. I use that favorite term of mine today, ontology, right? It's kind of like an ontological shock, right? They have a certain view of the world, and they're going along operating under that theory of the world, and then all of a sudden something happens to them that completely upends that. Most of the world is still the same, but all of a sudden they realize it's not as same as they thought. There's something really strange going on that sort of upends their paradigm. It really is akin to Kuhn's paradigm shift, except this is the individual personal paradigm that's getting upended and overturned. And that in itself is an emotionally traumatic event, which is why it's so hard to change paradigms in society, is because it's emotionally challenging for everyone who's invested in that paradigm. So ultimately, the content of these experiences, sometimes they are traumatic, but generally speaking, they're neutral, depending on how you interpret them. And the interpretation is skewed by our society and by the way we perceive the world.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because, you know, in a perfect world, we want people's extraordinary experiences to be wonderful and joyful and empowering events, right? But then I was thinking earlier today, what would the world look like if we were all having these experiences and we had no shame about them? And I wonder if maybe there's a purpose that the fear and the shame, if there's a purpose, if it's something that fear and shame is serving. And who is it serving?
Can I make a comment
Yeah.
on that? A couple of things. First, I wanted to comment on having therapists that are trained in handling this type of thing. That is very important, very important. But it's also very important that we have clergy that is trained. And for the most part, we don't. And my experience when it happened to me, I felt like it was a spiritual / religious experience. And I tried for years to find clergy that could help me. And basically I'd get a pat on the head and, oh, you're fine, you're fine. And I wasn't fine. So I do think that that's also important. I also wanted to address the trauma aspect. The near-death experience itself was not traumatic. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. That's an understatement. But being struck by lightning, that's trauma. So I'm wondering if I guess anytime there's a near-death experience, there has been a trauma that has gotten you near death, pretty much. So maybe those do go hand in hand. I don't know, just a thought. Also, I wanted to address something you said, Paul. I'm jumping around here. No, I also, for a long time, I wondered how to document my precognitive, well, they were nightmares. I was having nightmares. And finally, I realized I could email myself. And so they're date and time stamped, you know, what I had a nightmare about, and then a day or two later, it would be on the news. So, yeah, I mean, I know it happens. I know it's not unusual. I didn't talk about it for 27 years because I was afraid of what society would think, and I was afraid I would lose all my friends. I was afraid I would lose all my credibility. I was afraid my children wouldn't have any friends because they're the children of the crazy mother. And so I didn't talk about it. But what happened that changed my mind and got me talking about it, number one, my children grew up. So that's not a fear anymore. But it's the internet. And I don't know if the internet has either just exposed us all to these ideas more, which makes them more accepted, or whether it's just desensitized us. And it doesn't really matter which it is. It is more accepted now, I feel like.
I just want to very quickly add, writing is hugely therapeutic. People don't realize how valuable that is in sorting this out. And the fact that you were able to make that evidentiary by having the timestamp on it, that's very comforting, because then if somebody challenges you later on, you can say, here's the evidence. You know, I am not crazy because I can show you that it really happened. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Elizabeth just said. There really is a social cost, or at least a fear of a social cost, of coming forward with these experiences. And I think the concern about being judged as maybe not being mentally stable, or being attention-seeking, or something, is real. And if I were still practicing law, I probably would have been a little more hesitant to share some of my experiences. Fortunately, I'm in the business of having these experiences and helping people use them in a practical way to help others. So I'm able to speak about that pretty openly. But I can't say that there hasn't been a social cost. I mean, definitely there were friends who backed away, and I did have to be sensitive to how it was impacting family members. So that is a real concern. In my practice, though, by the time people seek us out for help, we're often a last resort for them. They've exhausted all the other ways to get the information that they need. And so by the time they get to us, there's a certain flexibility in their willingness to consider that maybe this works, and in fact, a real hope and desire that it does work and that it is real. So you can imagine someone coming with a missing person case for a family member. And if the police have not been able to solve the case, they really need the information, they're willing to talk to us more. So that's good. One of the issues with the fear of condemnation also is that this sort of subject matter, this field does have an unfortunate history of fraud. And so being able to address that by, through documentation, by being able to show, written proof, like some of the things that Paul has talked about, is very important. We have been criticized in the press. We got some pretty harsh comments a few years ago. And what people don't realize is we spend hundreds of hours each year doing pro bono work on missing person cases. So there are a lot of issues out there, and I think just society sometimes doesn't know what to do with this. And I think the solution is having more of it come out and having it be documented and having more people tell their stories like this.
And I don't know, I just want to add another element to what we're already speaking, which is complex. And this, I think, at least from my understanding, applies a lot with clairaudience, clairvoyance, or any kind of messaging, is the burden. So it's not just about the pain and the shame, but also the burden you carry, because now what do you do with this? Am I going to knock on that friend or the neighbor, or especially if I'm able to recognize who that person is, and if that person is in my network, what do I do with it? And that burden, I think, for me individually, has been one of the most difficult to navigate. From, being from at one point, I used to be very open about it, and I was like, okay, I would just go and tell them. But then, do you? And then how do they respond? I've had situations where somebody very close to me in my family said, but I never gave you permission to tell me. And so why are you telling me? And I'm like, I'm telling you because I love you and I want you to be protected. But so it's not just, there is the pain and the shame, and that itself is a very large category to deal with. But there is also the burden and what you do with it, and how that truly, I mean, I can again individually say it just eats you up sometimes, and it's not easy. And then you go to a therapy session and they give you these very clinical, okay, write it down, don't do anything, burn it, let the ashes go. No, I mean, this is...
That works really well. No.
Yeah, but yes, exactly. And I'm like, no, this is someone I really, really care. Do I say or not say? So I think we also have to talk about personal burden that happens when you're going through these, if you just happen to have that kind of...
Can I address that? Is that okay?
Sure, yeah.
Sure.
You're running the show, Annalisa.
Yeah,
Okay, I got her
one more
permission.
comment is fine.
Okay. So that is a definite problem. So particularly with the Stark session, which I knew, I got that data 2 days in advance, could technically have stopped that from happening, right? But here's the conundrum when you're doing a precog thing like this, right? Is that if you stop it from happening, then what happens the next time? So you could work this scenario. Well, we believed it was wrong anyway, so we didn't do anything with it. But if we had accepted it as data and we sent it up the channel, up through DIA, and then they would have, one of the reasons the Stark was attacked because it had all its air defense radars turned off. They weren't expecting an attack, right? If they'd have been up, the Iraqi jet would have detected them and very likely would not have fired, okay? So let's say we did that, okay? And the radars were on and the Iraqi didn't shoot. Well, then we were wrong, right? It didn't happen, right? So all those psychics, they screwed it up again, right? So the next time there was an event like that and we gave them a warning, they wouldn't have believed us, the cry wolf thing, right? That's one way of looking at it, right? You just maybe prevent the disaster for a little while, but it comes back again. But that's not the issue you're talking about anyway. Mm-hmm. I get people contacting me all the time. Well, I had this dream that there was a government building that was attacked and it was on fire and blah, blah, blah. What do I do with that information? You know people in the intelligence world. Would you report it for me? I say, okay, where's the building? When's it going to happen? How does it happen and who did it? I don't know. Okay. There's a certain set of actionable information you have to provide, or the information is essentially useless, right? And so I try and explain that to them. But there's also, this gets into the writing thing, there's also a recommendation I give them. I say, write it down. Write it down. If you can do a date time stamp, you can mail it to yourself, you can email it to yourself, you have a trusted person you can email it to, whatever. Write it down, keep track of it, keep a journal of precognitions. And then if that seems to be fulfilled at some point, record that fulfillment. And if you get a track record of those things and it's accurate enough to be actionable, at that point you can go down and show the authorities, look, this is what I've done. The next time I get one of these, I'm coming to tell you. And they will listen to you, much more likely. So I tell them that as well. So it doesn't directly address what you're saying, but I know people who are really anguished because they feel like they've gotten this gift from God, so to speak, right? This precognition. And they feel like they need to do something with it. Oftentimes there's nothing you can do with it, sadly. So anyway.
So you're getting into exactly what I wanted to talk about next.
Oh, good. We were reading your mind, Annalisa.
Yeah, you probably were. So I wanted to get away now from shame, and I want to talk more about success, because I've got a panel of very successful people here, and I want to tap into that. So I joke with my friends that I am the most useless psychic you will ever meet. Here's another story. I got a new bike a few years ago, and I was going to try biking for exercise and stuff like that. And so the first time I'm on my bike, I'm really enjoying this. I'm like, wow, this is a whole different experience of the world. Like, I'm more noticing, things that are on the ground and the space. It's not like being in a car. It's wonderful. And then I'm like, I bet you I'm going to find some money on this bike. And I literally visualize money being crumpled up on the sidewalk, next to the sidewalk. So sure enough, about 2 minutes go by, and there's that wadded up bill on the ground. So I stop, and then I get off the bike, and I go and pick up that crumpled up bill, and it's $1. And I'm like, gee, universe, thanks for sending me $1. Send me 2 more, and I might be able to buy a cup of coffee. I also have a tendency to dream about my administrative emails before waking up. So the question I have for anybody who feels like answering it, how do you focus your impossible experiences or your impressions into something that is reliable or valuable? And Paul, you're already kind of doing that a bit, but that's open to anybody who wants to take it.
Yeah, I think I'd rather pass for now. I'm happy to respond to it, but I don't want to be the main guy up here, even though I am outnumbered 4-1. But
I'll take that one. So that is a huge challenge. We know this works. I'm working with a team of remote viewers who have wonderful track records, and I could show you lots of their sessions with feedback. But the challenge is to not only get that information, but to analyze it and turn it into something actionable in time to do something with it. And very much like the story Paul just told about the start. I mean, you had the information, but without the analysis to actually identify and pinpoint exactly what it was describing, after the fact, you can look at it and say, gee whiz, that was really cool, and it is really cool. But to make it actionable is a much, much bigger challenge. And there's a lot we still have to learn about that. And I think that's one of those things that, like every other area of human endeavor, you have to practice. You have to do a lot of it and study it, and we'll get better over time.
I think that, I'll let you go in just a second. I was just going to say that actually has been kind of the answer for me recently. Is it's about practice. I'm also a musician, and you get out of the instrument the amount of time you put into it, and I think there's going to be some corollaries with impossible experiences. Elizabeth.
I think in talking about success and using this to be successful, I think for me, I also, as far as the precognition, I get information about plane crashes a lot. And many times I have the flight number, the airline, how many people are on board, and sometimes where it's going to crash. And do I call the FAA? No. There's a couple of things. First of all, people have free will. So not every time I have a nightmare does a plane crash. A mechanic may find that loose screw before the plane takes off and tighten it, and then the plane doesn't crash. So that's not talking about success, though. Success for me is helping people by taking away their fear of death, helping people that are in hospice. I have no fear of death, and I think it helps when people hear stories like this, especially if they're facing death themselves or have a loved one facing death or recently that died. And so for me, that's where I feel success. I feel like I've helped. Yeah, so it's not so much, I haven't monetized it. I haven't turned it into a business. It just, I get phone calls all the time from people that say, I heard I should talk to you. And it makes me feel great when that happens, and it helps them.
And for me, it's the same. One is practice for sure. I do practice, my practice is within my lineage. But like you, for me, it's not just the fear of death, it's fear, period. And I've understood this as a gift. And because it's a gift, I will not accept any form of money ever. So I have, again, just very recently, I would say, decided to be a little more open about it and be willing to have more people call me. Because I'm also in the academia, so I did a little bit of the dance of how much do I let this know to people. But I think I'm beyond it. I'm like, you know what, academia, if you don't love me, they do so far, but if you don't love me, your loss. So I've kind of gone a little further, but no, totally. I'm on the fear space, and no money, like no money will ever touch my hand for this space or this healing or this service, however we call it. Yeah.
Paul, do you have anything else, or should we open up for questions?
Yeah, so I kind of feel like your question is practically oriented. What techniques would you suggest? Is that where you're going with that?
What does success mean for you?
Oh, success? Success means not being wrong.
Yes.
Not being right either is close to success. But, well, I think I'm going to give you some practical ideas
Please
anyway. And of course, so the thing about remote viewing, I like to say that the most distinctive thing about remote viewing, as opposed to any other kind of psychic modality, is that it recognizes this phenomenon that we call mental noise, and it gives you techniques how to deal with it. Okay, so what mental noise, what I'm talking about, is all the racket that's going on in our heads all the time. The guesses, the speculations, the memories, and all that kind of stuff that's seething around in there. And anytime you try and be psychic, that kicks in with a vengeance, because, and I'm going to speak simplistically, if there's psychologists in the room, they'll know I'm being overly simplistic, but we'll talk right brain, left brain here, okay? So by and large, the right brain seems to be where most psychic behavior emerges, right? And this is based on laboratory studies at SRI, and it's, there's a little bit of hand-waving going, but nonetheless, it's worth considering in these terms. Left brain is what does the analysis. In fact, there's a prominent experimental psychologist named Michael Gazzaniga who's gotten into the split brain research very deeply. He talks about the left brain interpreter, which gets the information that your senses perceive and then proceeds to tell you what it means. So when you're in this, for want of a better term, psychic environment, you're getting this very subtle signal coming in, and it's easy to, first of all, not recognize to begin with, but then when you do recognize it, then your left brain kicks in, this left brain analyst kicks in, and it starts telling you what it means. But it doesn't have enough information to go on, so it's jumping to a lot of conclusions. Okay? So you end up getting false positives, wrong answers, misbeliefs about what it is you're experiencing. And that happens in any ESP-based modality. Okay? And now when we're in this particular environment we're talking about now, oftentimes the people who call me up with these presentiments, saying there's a building that's burning down, whatever, they often turn out to be wrong. Okay, I don't say it that bluntly to them because the future hasn't got there yet, right? So, but when you do start seeing their prediction and comparing to things that do happen, it oftentimes tends not to happen. And what happens is you get an impression, and then you have to decide whether it's something that you really are getting as an impression or something that you're making up, not intentionally, but still making up. And how do you tell the difference? That's where the practice part comes in, right? And that's where the record-keeping part comes in, right? You keep track of what you think you're perceiving and whether it turns out or not, and you start thinking, okay, now what of that could be conflation, what of that could be mental noise, And over time, you'll say, well, that one turned out to be not right. That one turned out to be right. What's the difference between those two things? And over time, you'll tend to learn that. It's never perfect, but you'll tend to learn that. And you will tend to be right in your judgments about whether what you're getting is veridical or not and whether it ought to be trusted. And so that's just how I generally say you could deal with that.
Thanks, Paul. I think this is probably a good time to take questions. Oh, hello. Okay. I saw you in the red shirt. I saw you first.
We like questions because it helps pass the time.
Thank you very much, and I've enjoyed everything that you've been speaking about. And I have a question that I actually came to the conference with, and I'm hoping you'll be able to help me with it. Through my life, I've had lots of spiritual and mystical experiences, and I've taken them very seriously, and they've had a very big impact on my life. And then 7, 8 years ago, I read Authors of the Impossible, which had a very big impact on my life because I realized that I had always had some what would be considered paranormal experiences. But I never took them seriously, and I always put them in a basket of, wow, that was weird. And so I realized reading that book that I have a distinction in my mind between a mystical and spiritual experience and a paranormal experience. And of course here, we're talking about experiences of the impossible. So that's helpful because I can wrap a big circle around the whole thing. But I'm still with this question of wanting to know if there's a difference. Because sitting here, listening to everyone here, really, I can see all mystical experiences essentially are paranormal, and all paranormal experiences are essentially spiritual. And yet I'm still curious about the distinction I seem to make in my own mind around these things. And I'm just curious if any of you have something that will help.
I have something to say about that because I had the same kind of question. And for me, the paranormal is spiritual. And I think it's one thing. It's all one thing because what it all leads to is the fact that consciousness survives death. And that's it. All of it points to that.
And for me, it is not. For me, my spiritual religious is very different, distinct from what I would call clairvoyance, clairaudience, or any kind of messaging. For me, these are two very distinct parallel systems of sorts, but it's my spiritual, my religious that helps me with my training and my practice, my sadhana, to be able to fine-tune and sift through some of the stuff that comes on this side. So it's, for me, two very different registers of sorts. But they kind of speak to each other. They support each other, they help each other, but they're two very different registers.
We've been talking a lot about terminology at this event so far, and one word I was thinking about it earlier today, especially in clinical parapsychology, we like the word exceptional experiences, and they don't necessarily need to be paranormal or religious or spiritual. It's just something that is above and beyond or different from your normal routine. Runners have, peak experiences. That's also exceptional. But I think it's a useful category to reflect on.
Yeah, I think this is an area where humility is in order. There's so much we don't know, that I don't know, about how this works, that I wouldn't even hazard a guess as to where you draw the line between spiritual and paranormal. What I can say from my experience in doing remote viewing work is I do see a distinction between spontaneous experiences and intentional experiences, both of which are valid. But the spontaneous ones might be things like dreams or just sudden precognitive knowings, where the intentional is where you sit down and you have a specific question or you've been tasked to come up with an answer, and you use some methodology like remote viewing to get that. So I do see a bright line there. But as for the spiritual paranormal, I don't know.
Okay. Is there another
So,
oh, sorry.
wait.
Sorry.
She was afraid she was going to give me a word in edgewise. No. So I think this is a very profound question, actually, when you got right down to it. And I probably have a couple of answers, but I'll only offer you one because it's the only one that I have fleshed out in my head. So the mystical experience is, of course, from what I understand, much different than, in some respects, than having a clairvoyant or whatever experience. But you might think of it this way. So the mystical experience is kind of contentless in a way. It's a pure experience where you have this feeling about the universe and yourself and the fact that there's no border between the two and you're just experiencing, right? I used to do, when I used to work on farms up in Wyoming, in the summers, put myself through school, and my uncle had this, where I was working one time, he has this alfalfa field in the bottomland by a creek. And one day I was walking across that, and it was just before the hay was ready to be cut, and it was absolutely the deepest, most beautiful emerald green you could imagine. And this was getting on towards sunset, so the sun was coming down at an angle. And as I'm listening to the meadowlarks out there chirping and the fragrance that was coming from the creek bed and all the plants around it, it's just absolutely glorious. The sun was coming down, and there were literally millions of these little dragonflies hovering over that green alfalfa, and their wings caught that light. And it was like a million shimmering gold flakes on that deep emerald green of the hay. And I'm looking at that, and I was just struck how beautiful that was in all the dimensions of beauty. All five senses were overwhelmed by the beauty. And I just stopped, and I stopped thinking. Literally, I said, I'm not going to think about anything. I'm just going to feel. And I put myself in that condition. And for a while, I was able to do that. It's really hard to turn off your brain, as you can imagine. But that's probably as close to a mystical experience as I've gotten. But the reason I describe it in those terms is because that was contentless. I wasn't thinking about dragonflies. I wasn't thinking about meadowlarks. I was experiencing it exclusively. To me, that's kind of the mystical thing. The so-called paranormal stuff, the actual behavior, is the content that can emerge from that. So it's like the mystical experience is the ground and not in earth ground, but the ground of the experience, and it provides the field upon which these mystical or these paranormal experiences emerge. I don't know if that's right, but that's what I'm thinking about right now.
That's great. Thank you all very much.
Okay, next question. Right there. We'll do next.
Thank you. This is a beautiful panel. My question is a biological, not ontological, and it's for the whole panel in terms of the practice. We know now that they're able to embed information, intelligence, and consciousness in water. In all your experiences, what has been the role of water, and how has that played in terms of how is that in the environment or in the experience? I know you've had the experience with lightning, but water is that which connects us all as living beings. But I'm just wondering what might be in that realm of the role of water as medium for all of this.
After the lightning, there was a lot of water. I fell into a puddle. It was raining. And then in my near-death experience, I ended up in a garden with a stream, and I could hear the water. So it wasn't just visual. I could hear it. And then also, when I have these plane crash nightmares, many times water's involved. The plane crashes in the ocean, or in the instance of Captain Sully, the plane landed on the water, on the Hudson River. So water is big in my case.
Same with me. but not the way you experienced it, or it comes. For me, I can almost feel the water element in my body to be a lot more activated of sorts. So the tattva is very, very active. And typically once I call myself the portal at that point, once that message, whatever it is, has come through, I'm parched, I'm dehydrated, I am thirsty, and to a point where my throat hurts. It's a very strange kind of thirst, and so that's kind of my relationship with water.
My experiences are sporadic and useless, so I don't have anything. Anybody else before I take another? Yeah.
So I know this will. Oh, wait a minute, I got to get a drink. No, I know this will shock Gail and probably some of the rest of you out there, but I have no opinion about this. I don't know.
Okay, we had a question at the front here.
Hello. Thank you guys for sharing all your stories and being here, number one. Number two, as a father, how should we approach the younger generations on these topics? Remote viewing, PK, astral projection, precognition, and intuition, so they can move from the fringe to the normal with our next generation.
Okay, I'm going to do it. So I have 4 kids. Oh, the first thing I want to say, this is the principle. You want to treat it as normal. Then we don't run into the problems that we had that this paper introduces. If your kids recognize it as normal, they're not going to have trauma about this. Even if they do have a traumatic experience, they'll recognize that they're not all that way. You know, all these aren't like that. It'll give them a normalization for unusual occurrences, right? I've tried to engage all my kids in this. When they were little, that was when I was still assigned at the at Fort Meade in the remote viewing unit. I would take my first 3, I hadn't had the 4th one yet, first 3 over to the operations building, and I was trying to get them to douse the lottery. So I had a matrix, you know, all the numbers that the lottery would be, and I had these small Reese's peanut butter cups, and I'd give them the stack, and they'd have the matrix there, and I'd say, okay, I want you to put one of these on each of the squares you think you're going to see a Reese's cup on, the small ones, tomorrow, which would be after the lottery was drawn. I better not get too close to that. Anyway, and so they would put them on there, and then I'd say, okay, and I keep track of it. And then when the lottery was drawn, I kept track of each one of them individually. I'd figure out which squares were correct, and I would put the cups on the correct squares. And they got to eat the ones that they got right, okay? And the best we did was 4. We got 4 of them right. And I thought, darn it, I didn't realize that was in the money on the lottery. We would have made $100,000 if I cashed that ticket in. but that wasn't, I mean, that was the goal. I mean, I was in debt, and, you know, I was going through a divorce, and we needed some income. So that was disappointing. I wish I'd been paying better attention to the rules. But my 3 sons have actually, in one way or another, participated in remote viewing with me. 2 of them have taken my basic course. One of them did an experiment at the University of Colorado in associative remote viewing, which was highly successful with his class there. My youngest son did a 4th grade science fair project on remote viewing that was highly successful and absolutely freaked his teacher out. It was awesome. In fact, that got written up, at least represented in a Scholastic book, Scholastic book, right, on paranormal things. And so they all are pretty accepting of it. Now, here's the drawback to that. That is, it's so normal that they aren't all that interested in it. You know, it's kind of, oh yeah, that's something Dad does. I've done a little bit of it. It's pretty cool, but you know what? I'd rather go on a date. You know, so that's an interesting, unfortunate consequence of getting them engaged. But I think that's still better that they feel like this is normal, then that you make it weird to them in some way by the way you act.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
There's a middle ground, though. I
Yeah.
mean, I have 6 kids, and you don't, you do want to normalize it, but you don't want them to not have any friends. You know, you've got to temper it with, they have to live in this world. They have to socialize. And so it's a really good question, and it's a fine line. And now, would I do it differently now that now they're my grandchildren, they're not my children. And so I don't treat them the same as I treated my children, because I kind of feel like it's their parents' problem. But just the other day, one of my grandsons, I pick him up from school every Thursday. And last week on Thursday, I picked him up. He gets in the car. He's 7. He said, Grandma, I have to ask you a question. I said, what is it? He said, do you believe in UFOs? And I said, I do. I do believe in UFOs. I don't think we're the only ones here. And he said, so you believe in aliens? And I said, I do. And he said, that's interesting. I mean, so he can think I'm strange, maybe, I don't know. And it's getting him thinking about it. But do I think he's going to go to school and talk about it with other people? Probably not. And that's probably a good thing, unfortunately, because society just isn't there yet. And that's just my opinion. And I really don't know much about raising kids. So
But how is society going to get there?
well,
you know?
I know. I know.
Sorry, go ahead.
My experience is similar to Paul's. I have 2 sons, and they have seen me as I've gone on this journey, and this has been dinner table conversation at our house for many years. So for them, it is normal. The one thing I would add to that is I would encourage people who are exposing their kids to this to also help them learn how to use discernment, how to not be overly credulous. This stuff is really neat and cool, but there's also a lot of garbage out on the internet. There is a place for legitimate skepticism. So when I talk about these things with my boys, I show them the examples, they've seen it. But we also talk about, well, what could be another explanation for what you just saw or what someone has reported? How could you discern which explanation is the right one? Or how could you set up an experiment to untangle these things? So as neat and amazing as this stuff is, I think you do need to arm them with the tools they need to discern what's real.
I'm a product of being normal. So my parents, especially my father, he never made a big deal of it or asked me to shut up. Then when I became a mom, I also started grad school here, so I would bring my daughter to all kinds of classes, and she would sit under the table, play Nintendo DS, which was very popular at that time. But she did, when she was about 12, 13, once told me, Mama, don't say these things. People will think we are weird, and nobody will be our friends. So I said, okay. So I said, you tell me when you're ready for me to talk again. And she said, okay. So it lasted maybe a few months. But I think the fact that I told her I will not say till she was going to give me permission again, I think was a really good call looking back. And to have, Jeff and Klein and Bill Parson and Elias, and for her to be around religious studies at Rice was easy for me. So that was easy parenting access. But I think also respecting when they say don't talk or don't say, giving them that space to just hold and see where it goes. Yeah.
So I'm not a parent, and I also was given the 5-minute warning. So I think we have time for one more question. And you were keeping better track, I think, than me. Who should it be?
I just had I just wanted to ask something real quick. She'd already given me the microphone. I wanted to go back to the water and consciousness comment. Does anybody know if anybody's ever done a study of the water that comes from a woman's womb. If stem cells and the blood of a stem cell has the power of the healing, does the water that comes from the woman's womb have a consciousness or within, or a frequency or an energy that is lost that maybe could be studied? I didn't know if any of those kind of studies had ever been done.
So in Tantra, menstruation blood is a big thing, and even the womb and the placenta is a very empowering thing. So there is a lot written on that front.
All right, you want to call on the last person?
I think someone from either here
Right there?
or the three all
You-
did it together. So
The
you
guy
pick.
with the black mask?
Yeah.
This
I
guy.
think they're talking about you, Dan.
Thanks. So great panel. This is kind of an uneasy question for a lot of people to address. I'm going to attempt to ask or posit it respectfully. Speaking on discernment, there are a lot of people who don't have the best interest to fall into these areas of work, who are exploitive of gullibility and naivete, who make everyone who's doing the actual work in this in a serious way look bad, unfortunately. Aside from misinterpreted experiences or valid attempts that yielded incorrect information based upon your respective fields and lines of research and work, how should liars and charlatans be handled when it comes to this field?
Well, let's take capital punishment off the table first, shall we?
I think the best thing to do is ignore them. They're seeking attention. And if you ignore them, maybe they'll just go away. I mean, personally, that's what I would do, is ignore them.
Yeah, I think trying to address that is going to be an endless game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
And your energy, I mean, it's unfortunate, and I wish there was something, but I think that, at least for me, that energy and time is better spent doing good work and documenting that and showing how we did that and showing that it is real. It is a problem, but that's how I would choose to spend my time and energy.
I think you do need to, though, recognize that they really pull the whole field down. Certainly the skeptics, they'll talk about all the rampant fraud in the parapsychology world. And there is fraud in it, but it's not in the scientific parapsychology realm. There's a tiny bit there, but there's probably more in mainstream science than there is in parapsychology itself in terms of academic or research parapsychology. But because of all of this in the, I guess, the popular psychic field, for want of a better term, they're able to use that and then use that as a brush to tar the entire field. And so it's important that folks who want to support this positively, anytime you get a chance, point out that there's a difference between the popular field and the people who are serious researchers and serious promoters. Okay, and the incidence of fraud in the more responsible part of it is trivial, virtually insignificant, and that's what we care about anyway. So, but we do need to make that distinction. We also have to educate the public about this, because the skeptics have done such a great job of educating them the other way, right? We need to counteract that. Now, doing it individually, Gail's right. You never manage it, but corporately, we need to keep that in mind all the time when we talk to people. So,
I think what Paul is saying is really important. Personally, I'm in a place where I'm less concerned about proof-oriented research and really more interested in getting at the process. And so for me, the Elizabeth's response, withholding attention, at least for me, is the best way to go.
thank you very much.
Thank you.